From the coroner, who himself sent a body to the morgue, to others caught committing unspeakable acts against the dead, here are evil coroners who forgot there were cameras. Starting with Christopher Dontel. Christopher Dontel, a former deputy coroner in Horry County, South Carolina, had one job: to handle the dead with dignity and respect. Instead, he took handling the dead to a whole new criminal level. This guy didn't just work around dead bodies, he helped create one. And it was all due to an already messed up workplace affair gone horribly wrong. It all came crashing down in 2020 when Gregory Rice was reported missing. Rice, a 46-year-old father, vanished on October 5th, and weeks of searching turned up nothing. That is until November 8th, when his body was discovered along the Little PD River near the Horry and Marion County line in South Carolina. It was a grim scene. Rice had been shot 5 times, his body wrapped in a tarp, secured with zip ties, and weighted down with cinder blocks. Investigators quickly realized that someone had gone to great lengths to hide this crime, and it didn't take long for suspicion to fall on Dontel. It turns out that just days before Rice's disappearance, Dontel had been caught on surveillance cameras at a Lowe's hardware store. His shopping cart was a how to get away with murder kit in plain sight, cement blocks, a tarp, and zip ties. This wasn't exactly your average weekend DIY project, especially when you consider his day job, a deputy coroner who knew all the tricks to make a body vanish. Unfortunately for him, security cameras don't lie. But how did Dontel wound up with this shopping list from hell? Well, the roots of this crime go back to 2019, when a woman called Megan Jackson's life started falling apart. Her 16-year relationship ended, her mother passed away, and she found herself spiraling. Jackson had 4 kids with Gregory Rice, and even though their romantic relationship was over, they maintained contact for the sake of the children. But when Jackson began working at the coroner's office as a body transporter, she met Dontel, sparks flew, and soon, Dontel, a married father of 2, and the struggling single mom were entangled in a messy, illicit affair. But things got even more complicated real soon when Megan got pregnant with his child. By late 2020, her relationship with Rice had reportedly become really strained. Police believe the lovers saw Rice as an obstacle to their twisted future together, and so they allegedly plotted his murder. Jackson, according to prosecutors, gave the chilling directive to Dontel. She said, "It was him or you. I need you to go get him out of the cooler at the Myrtle Beach funeral home and get rid of him." The sequence of events was damning. Rice was last seen on October 2nd, and by October 3rd, Dontel was on his hardware store shopping spree. By November 8th, Rice's body was found, and on November 11th, both Dontel and Jackson were arrested. Investigators pieced together their movements using cell phone data, witness interviews, and of course, those incriminating surveillance videos. While awaiting trial, the pair violated their bond terms by contacting each other. They were supposed to stay apart, but apparently, forbidden love is hard to resist. They exchanged messages and even met in person while Jackson was on house arrest. The court didn't take kindly to that, and both were thrown back behind bars. In court, the prosecution laid out the grisly details of the murder, painting a picture of a couple so desperate to be together that they conspired to kill an innocent man. Seeing the sort of future that awaited him in prison, Dontel ultimately agreed to plead guilty to criminal conspiracy to commit murder and accessory after the fact. The deal meant he'd have to testify against Jackson, potentially sealing her fate. But it wasn't just murder that raised alarms. During the investigation, authorities discovered Jackson had been abusing her children. Police found that she had locked the kids in rooms, forcing them to urinate in jars. The windows of this room were padlocked, and the electronic door locks were disabled. It was a house of horrors behind closed doors. This clearly won't sit right with the jury, so we can expect her to be locked away for good. As for the evil coroner, he faces up to 20 years behind bars for his role in the crime, and his testimony likely to play a key role in his lover's prosecution. Next on the list, Kenneth Douglas. Kenneth Douglas must not have read his job description right, because instead of properly dealing with dead bodies, he turned the Hamilton County morgue into his personal horror show. From 1976 to 1992, Douglas worked the night shift at the morgue. This was seemingly a mundane job, but it was perfect to hide his dark secret. You see, Kenneth was sexually abusing corpses at his place of work, and it is suspected that he might have defiled up to 100 of them. In a deposition, Douglas admitted to the grotesque acts, stating, "I would just get on top of them and pull my pants down. His grim confession sent shockwaves through Cincinnati and beyond, leaving the public horrified and the victims' families devastated. This wasn't just a one-off incident fueled by an occasional lapse in judgment. No, Douglas was a repeat offender. He was also often drunk or high while committing his crimes. Douglas didn't discriminate when it came to his victims. Age, background, and circumstances didn't matter. If a body was there and Douglas was under the influence, he acted on his depraved impulses. His substance abuse played a significant role in his crimes, with alcohol and drugs lowering whatever moral inhibitions he might have had. The nightmare unraveled in 2008 when DNA evidence linked Douglas to the body of Karen Range, a 19-year-old murder victim from 1992. Investigators had initially convicted David Stephan for her murder, but DNA testing revealed that Stephan hadn't Range. Instead, Douglas had assaulted her body after her death while she lay in the morgue awaiting an autopsy. The revelation opened a can of worms. Douglas eventually confessed to violating dozens more corpses. As a result of this, in 2012, the families of the victims sued Hamilton County. They argued that the county had failed to supervise Douglas properly, essentially enabling his vile acts. Sadly, the county maintained it couldn't be held responsible for the actions of a rogue employee, but the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals disagreed. What can be considered the final nail in the county's coffin was the revelation that Douglas's wife had actually called the morgue to report her husband coming home smelling like sex and alcohol. Their response was something you wouldn't expect. The county allegedly replied, "Whatever happens on county property in county time is county business." Talk about negligence. The morbid tale of Kenneth Douglas exposed the dark side of institutional oversight. While morgue staff should have been safeguarding the dignity of the deceased, Douglas was exploiting it night after night. What's bizarre is that there was no proper surveillance, which basically gave Douglas an open access pass. His crimes weren't committed in a vacuum. They were facilitated by a culture of apathy and neglect. And let's be honest, when someone calls to say their spouse smells like sex and booze after a night shift at the morgue, maybe, just maybe, that should have raised some red flags for the rest of the staff. Douglas's activities went unchecked for years, with the morgue becoming his playground. His DNA linked him to multiple victims, including Charlene Edwards, 23, and Angel Hicks, 24, both of whom died violent deaths. Prosecutors later suggested that the true number of victims could be well over 100, though the exact count may never be known due to the lack of preserved DNA evidence from many cases. But how did Douglas keep this macabre spree going for so long? Simple. The morgue's management operated with a see no evil, hear no evil mentality. Prosecutor Joe Dieters described the situation as beyond belief, emphasizing how the county's failure to supervise Douglas effectively made them complicit in his crimes. His arrest and subsequent conviction sent shockwaves through the community. In 2008, Douglas was convicted of gross abuse of a corpse in 3 cases and received a 3-year prison sentence. The punishment felt like a slap on the wrist for many, given the gravity of his actions. When additional evidence surfaced, linking him to more victims, he was indicted on further charges. Prosecutors speculated that the actual victim count might never be fully uncovered. The case also highlighted systemic failures within Hamilton County. The morgue's laissez-faire attitude toward employee conduct created an environment where Douglas could act with impunity. The chilling response to Douglas's wife's call underscores just how deeply negligence was rooted in the system. For the families of the victims, the pain was immeasurable. Learning that their loved ones had been violated after death was a trauma beyond comprehension. The lawsuits against the county sought accountability, not just for Douglas's actions, but for the systemic failure that enabled his crimes. Douglas's crimes also sparked broader conversations about morgue oversight and the psychological screenings of those working in such sensitive environments. While the dead cannot advocate for themselves, institutions responsible for their care must be held to the highest standards. Hamilton County's lapse in judgment became a cautionary tale for morgues across the country. In court, Douglas didn't offer much in the way of remorse. His admissions were stark and unapologetic, painting a picture of a man whose humanity had been eroded by addiction and unchecked deviance. His lawyer argued that substance abuse played a significant role in his actions, but for the victims' families, this explanation rang hollow. The Range family, in particular, found themselves re-traumatized by the revelations. They had already endured the horror of Karen's murder. Discovering that her body had been defiled in the morgue morgue was an added layer of anguish. The conviction of David Stephan, which was once seen as justice, was now incomplete. Stephan had been convicted of rape and murder, but DNA evidence later proved he never raped Range, meaning part of his conviction was based on a false narrative. Douglas's crimes, therefore, not only desecrated bodies, but also muddled the justice system. As the lawsuits against Hamilton County unfolded, officials scrambled to address the glaring gaps in oversight. Training protocols were updated, background checks intensified, and morgue operations were restructured to prevent similar atrocities in the future. But these measures came too late for Douglas's victims. Moving on to David Fuller, or the morgue monster. David Fuller was supposed to fix wires and keep the lights on in the hospital where he worked, but quite ironically, he ended up plunging mourning families into further darkness. As a hospital electrician, he had unlimited access to the morgue, a privilege he abused while living under the radar for decades. It all started back in 1987 with what became known as the Bedsit murders in Royal Tunbridge Wells, Kent. Wendy Nell, a 25-year-old who managed a Supa Snaps photo shop, was found brutally murdered in her blood-soaked bed. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled in her bedsit. 5 months later, Carolyn Pierce, a 20-year-old waitress, was abducted outside her bedsit. Her body turned up 40 miles away, half submerged in a flooded drain, her clothes missing except for a pair of tights, which was still left on. Both cases left police baffled for more than 3 decades. As for Fuller, he carried on with life as if he hadn't committed 2 horrible murders. While his DNA was in the system after a cold case review in 2007 linked both murders to the same unknown suspect, it wasn't until 2020 that the database finally spit out a name: David Fuller. When officers arrived at his home, they didn't just find a man who'd killed 2 young women. They uncovered something even more horrifying. David Fuller didn't just kill. He violated bodies in ways that defy human decency. As an electrician at Kent and Sussex Hospital and later Tunbridge Wells Hospital, he exploited his after-hours access to the morgue to commit acts of necrophilia. For 15 years, this monster roamed the hospital's most sacred space, the mortuary. More than 100 women and girls aged 9 to 100 were subjected to his horrible acts. What's worse is that Fuller meticulously documented his crimes on hard drives hidden in his home office, collecting over 800,000 images and 500 videos. But how did he get away with it for so long? The inquiry later revealed gaping holes in hospital security. There was no CCTV in the post-mortem room, and the fridge doors were left unlocked where bodies were stored. Plus, no one ever questioned why an electrician was clocking extra hours in the morgue. One witness reported Fuller often stayed beyond his shifts, performing maintenance tasks that weren't needed. No one thought twice about it until his arrest in 2020. When police examined his computer, they found more than just evidence of his mortuary offenses. There were also disturbing signs of his lifelong obsession with violence against women. Murder and abuse, all cataloged with chilling precision. He didn't just commit these crimes, he seemed to treasure them. The DNA match from the Bedsit murders was what finally unmasked him. Investigators traced a DNA link to one of Fuller's relatives, leading them directly to him, and a single bloody fingerprint on a plastic bag at Wendy Nell's crime scene was the final nail in the coffin. In court, Fuller initially tried to dodge responsibility for the murders, but 6 days into his trial, he pled guilty. His admissions didn't stop there. He also confessed to 44 charges related to the abuse of 78 dead bodies. In total, investigators believe he desecrated at least 101 corpses, though the true number may never be known. The sentencing judge didn't mince words. In December 2021, David Fuller received a whole life term with no chance of parole. Justice Chima Grubb declared that Fuller would spend the rest of his mortal life behind bars for his unimaginable crimes. The damage extended far beyond the victims. Families who thought their loved ones were at peace learned they had been violated. Many were re-traumatized by the graphic nature of the evidence. The Fuller case prompted sweeping reforms in NHS mortuary practices. Phase 1 of an official inquiry revealed systemic failures that allowed his crimes to continue undetected. Hospitals across the UK have since implemented tighter security, including installing cameras and restricting after-hours access. David Fuller might have lived in the shadows for more than 3 decades, but in the end, justice found him. The morgue monster is now set to spend the rest of his living days in HMP Frankland, alongside other notorious criminals. Next up, Jerry Bridges. Jerry Bridges, a former coroner in Jones County, Georgia, was sentenced to 5 years in prison after pleading guilty to defrauding families who had prepaid him for the funeral and burial services of their loved ones. In addition to the prison term, Bridges received 15 years of probation for his actions. Bridges, 77, admitted to taking more than $200,000 from numerous families, using the funds for personal purposes rather than setting them aside for the funeral services he promised. His fraudulent activities came to light in June 2019 when he was arrested, leading to his resignation as coroner. Bridges had also owned and operated Cedar Ridge Cemetery in Gray, Georgia, even after selling his funeral home. The investigation revealed that Bridges had accepted advance payments from families, assuring them that the funds would be preserved for future funeral expenses. Instead, he diverted the money, leaving grieving families to discover that the services they paid for were never secured. In court, Bridges confessed to his actions and expressed regret, though his apology did little to ease the pain of those affected. During the sentencing hearing, several victims delivered emotional impact statements. One even described the betrayal as like a knife in the heart. Families shared how they struggled to come to terms with the deception, especially since Bridges had been a trusted figure in the community for decades. Bridges had built a reputation for professionalism and compassion over his long career. He began working as a coroner in the 1970s and became a well-known and trusted public servant. However, behind his respected mask, he was engaging in fraudulent practices that financially and emotionally harmed the very people he was supposed to support. The court ordered Bridges to pay restitution to the victims. To facilitate this, the state announced that it would seize and sell Cedar Ridge Cemetery, with the proceeds going toward repaying the defrauded families. Prosecutors expressed hope that the sale of the cemetery would generate enough funds to cover the losses. Despite his age and health issues, Judge Brenda Trammell denied a request to delay Bridges' imprisonment for 120 days to allow him time to sell the cemetery himself. Instead, he was taken into custody immediately following the sentencing. The case raised concerns about the oversight of prepaid funeral funds. Families believed their payments were safe, only to learn that there had been no proper safeguards in place. This situation highlighted the need for stricter regulations and monitoring within the funeral services industry to prevent similar incidents in the future. For the victims, the financial loss was significant. Many had to find alternative ways to cover funeral expenses, adding to the stress of losing a loved one. The emotional toll was equally severe, with families describing feelings of anger, sadness, and betrayal. Lastly, Dr. David Sootholz. Dr. David Sootholz used to be a respected name in northern Kentucky's medical community. However, his illegal activities resulted in a sudden decline in his popularity. The 74-year-old doctor, who served as Kenton County coroner for 3 decades, was ultimately sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in prison for illegally prescribing painkillers and other medications. His conviction left the community shocked and disappointed in the man they once adored. Sootholz, who also ran a family medical practice for 45 years, was found guilty on 12 counts of prescribing drugs like oxycodone, Xanax, and Valium without legitimate medical reasons. Prosecutors argued that he disregarded clear signs of addiction and continued to prescribe medications that fueled the region's drug abuse crisis. In one heartbreaking case, the drugs he prescribed contributed to a patient's fatal overdose. Throughout his career, Sootholz was known as a compassionate and dedicated doctor who cared deeply for his patients. Many of his supporters described him as someone who prioritized patient care over protocol. Sadly, he might have given in to his patients' demands a little too much. Still, his defense attorneys tried to use this as a positive thing, claiming that it wasn't greed that motivated the doctor, but rather a misguided belief that he knew what was best for his patients. This is pretty ironic if you think about it, considering that he's supposed to know what's best for his patients. Sootholz was looking to avoid imprisonment at all costs. They even asked for home detention and community service instead of prison time, highlighting his age and commitment to serving disadvantaged individuals. However, prosecutors painted a different picture. They pointed out that Sootholz had previously been sanctioned for improper prescribing practices, but still chose to ignore the warnings. According to them, this was part of the larger opioid crisis that has devastated countless lives across the country. They even questioned his competency as a doctor. The court ultimately decided on a prison sentence, with the U.S. District Judge David L. Bunning lying, also imposing a $5,000 fine. Prosecutors had initially sought more than 5 years behind bars, given the harm caused by Sootholz's reckless prescribing, but he was handed his 366-day prison sentence due to his advanced age. However, his legal team didn't give up easily. Despite the sentence, his legal team appealed the conviction, arguing that some evidence presented at trial was improperly admitted and that prosecutors failed to prove Sootholz acted with criminal intent. The fallout from the case has been immense. The community has struggled to reconcile the image of a compassionate doctor with the reality of his actions. For patients who genuinely needed his help, the betrayal has been profound. His case serves as a stark reminder of the responsibilities that come with medical authority and the devastating impact of prescription drug abuse. While this case might have wrapped up, Kenton County and the larger medical community are left to grapple with the consequences of his actions. That being said, it's a wrap on evil coroners who forgot there were cameras. Why do you think most of these criminals were able to evade arrest for so long? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section. And before you leave, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Criminal Corner so you don't miss the next ones.